And that takes us to our final album, De La Soul. And Josh, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. 3 Feet High and Rising. In the opening montage, you heard The Magic Number, and now you're going to hear I Know. Now, what about the stats on this album?
So 3 Feet High and Rising by De La Soul comes in at number 73 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 7 in 1989, number 504 of all time. It's De La Soul's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. It also made Rolling Stone's list, almost cracking the top 100, coming in at number 103. And De La Soul is ranked as the number 396th highest rated artist in Best Ever Albums.
Well, like Fugazi, this is a very influential rap and hip hop band, so I'll give you some good background on them. De La Soul consists of 3 members: Kelvin Mercer, aka Posthumous, aka Plug One, aka Pos, David Joliker, aka Trugoy the Dove, aka Plug Two, aka Dave, and their DJ Vincent Mason, aka Maceo, aka PA Pacemaster Mace, aka Plug 3. So you've got
aka Raekwon the Chef.
You've got Plug 1, Plug 2, and Plug 3 all together. Posthumous, if you're wondering, is an inversion of his DJ name, Soundsop, so it's just that backwards. And then Trugoy the Dove is his
was
favorite
yogurt, right?
Yep, his favorite food was yogurt, so it's just yogurt backwards.
I remember that as a kid hearing that, yeah.
Yeah, up front, sadly, Trugoy the Dove died in February of this year at the age of 54, shortly before their music finally became available on streaming. He had numerous health issues that finally took their toll. They are from Long Island, New York, and met while they attended Amityville High School. While they were there, they also met one Paul Houston, aka Prince Paul, who is the producer on this album, as well as their following 2 albums, De La Soul is Dead and Balloon Mind State. They also became part of the Native Tongues Collective, which is focused on positive-minded lyrics, Afrocentric style, and eclectic sampling of jazz-influenced beats. Other members of Native Tongues that you may have heard of are the Jungle Brothers, Tribe Called Quest, Queen Latifah, and UK rapper Money Love. Native Tongues are considered the pioneers of conscious hip-hop, alternative hip-hop, or jazz rap, which I've never heard of before I saw that. So definitely alternative and conscious hip-hop I'd known, though.
Is that like Diggable Planets and stuff? Would that be like jazz rap?
Yeah, I think that's definitely in that lineage.
Okay.
Kelvin Mercer recalls where they got their name. There's a really good New York Times article about them that came out right after their music came out on streaming that I'm gonna quote from heavily. He said, "I was like, we should call it From the Soul," Mercer recalled, and Dave was like, no, I like the meaning, Merce, but you need to spice it up. He looked at us and said De La, and we were like, yeah, that's it. So De La Soul just came from them thinking up names. As to what got them into the studio initially, Prince Paul was already of a rap group called Stetsasonic and heard their demo Plug Tuning and secured them a contract with Tommy Boy Records. 3 Feet High and Rising is their debut album and stood out, as you probably recognized, from the trend of gangster rap that is popular at this time and kind of all the other rap that we've listened to. The bright colors, positive lyrics, humor, psychedelia, and a style counter to what we've known in rap up to this point, along with the idea of the Daisy Age, an acronym standing for the inner sound, y'all, led to many critics to label them as the hippies of hip-hop. However, they did not like that label and became frustrated by it, and they always considered themselves to be constantly changing in their style, and they never wanted to be just one thing. In regards to their look, this is also from the New York Times article, quote, "They look like Outkast," recalled Monica Lynch, who signed the group to Tommy Boy Records in 1988. "Dave had this Gumby haircut. They're wearing weird clothes. They looked like the antithesis of what was the prevailing style aesthetic in hip-hop at the time," unquote. This album is very sample heavy, as we mentioned briefly last week at the end of our show. Not only did they sample from funk and soul tracks, but also doo-wop, psychedelic music, children's music. It's also been described as the first psychedelic hip-hop record. 3 Feet High and Rising is credited with introducing the hip-hop skit, a style of comedic sketch used to both introduce rap albums and as interludes between songs. Personally, something I've never been a fan of, but it's important to note that they started it. The album title comes from Johnny Cash's song 5 Feet High and Rising. The album artwork was designed by the British art collective Grey Organization, aka Go. This album received widespread critical acclaim on its release. It was the Village Voice's #1 album in their annual critics poll. Me, Myself, and I became a top 40 hit on the Billboard charts. It was #1 on the R&B charts, and it was 24 on the Billboard Top 200 albums, but #1 on the R&B albums. Retrospectively, this album and group continue to be highly regarded on many best of lists. NPR retrospective published this year said that 3 Feet High and Rising, quote, reshaped the public imagination of what hip-hop could be, and that it still sounds wondrous and weird in the musical landscape of the 2020s. Like Janet Jackson, in 2011, it joined the Library of Congress National Recording Registry for influential albums. And as of this year, it's their only album to be certified platinum. Now, I'm not going to give them a whole history of the group past this album, but I am going to talk somewhat at length about the streaming history of the streaming, why it wasn't on streaming, kind of the sampling controversy that John mentioned at the end of the show last week. This and the rest of their first 6 albums were not made available for digital purchase or streaming until March 3rd of this year, 2023. From the New York Times article again, after the Tommy Boy catalog was sold to Warner Music in 2002, De La Soul's music languished there, never officially released in digital form. In 2016, a representative of Rhino, Warner's catalog division, told the New York Times, "We don't believe it is possible to clear all the samples for digital use." In 2014, the group gave away downloads of their albums for free without authorization. That's actually how I got many of their albums initially. 3 years later, Tom Silverman, the founder of Tommy Boy, reacquired the label, but De La Soul feuded with him over its contract and called for a boycott of the label. Silverman declined to comment about the conflict. In 2021, he sold Tommy Boy to the music company Reservoir Media for $100 million. And so then, remarkably, the president of Reservoir actually gave the group back the rights to its master recordings, as he felt that was the only way that they would be able to get the samples cleared, was to do it themselves with the support of the label. The group then, De La Soul, then started to go through every snippet of tape from the first 6 Tommy Boy albums to check, identify, and clear every sample. More than 200 samples appear across those albums. The band hired Deborah Manis Gardner, the rap world's go-to sample clearance agent, and the work took more than a year for the band to clear all the samples. Not everything was cleared or was worth the money to do so. The band re-recorded what it said are tiny elements of this album. One track on 3 Feet High and Rising, I think it's the 4th or 3rd, called Cool Breeze on the Rocks, was a pastiche of more than 20 fragments in less than a minute by Public Enemy, Jefferson Starship, Africa Bambaataa, and others, using the word rock. Was too impractical to clear, so that has been reimagined. Also, I should note, I can't believe I didn't put this in, one of the controversies was that they used a sample of from the Turtles on this album that was slowed down, and that was the lawsuit that kind of started all of this going. Let me just find that.
Is that So Happy Together?
Let me see what song it is. Sorry, I thought I wrote this down, guys. Okay, so the group, the approach to sampling, this is from the New York Times article, turned out to be a bit too freewheeling. Not everything had been licensed properly from the owners of the copyrights. One problem was a 12-second slowed down fragment from the 1960s pop group The Turtles, who in 1991 sued De La Soul for more than $1 million. The case, which was settled for an undisclosed amount was one of the first high-profile lawsuits over sampling, and it had far-reaching implications throughout the music industry. De La became the guinea pig of it all, said Michelle Bayer, a music publishing executive who had long worked with the trio. They became the example of don't do what these guys did. So that really kind of put the group in its tracks, and all that sampling stuff that I mentioned is why it took so long for this album and their subsequent albums to become available on streaming. Fortunately, they fixed it and cleared all the samples, along with many other people who helped. Incidentally, they all became available on streaming March 3rd of 2023, 34 years to the day that 3 Feet High and Rising was released. I also listened to the March 8th episode of the New York Times Popcast podcast about music titled Celebrating De La Soul with Questlove, and they go in depth. It's about an hour-long podcast. I recommend you check that out if you want some more interesting and kind of context around De La Soul and what they brought to hip-hop. So, just I don't have any other data beyond what the albums in their career where it's after that, because I thought this was more important to talk about. But what did you think of De La Soul, 3 Feet High and Rising?
I think I go first on this one. So, oddly enough, I saw De La Soul. That's one of those.
Really?
When I was my freshman year of college, I talked about that show. I saw De La Soul, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, and Fishbone.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Which I was not at the time very excited about seeing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like because I knew of all of those bands, of those acts, but I never really knew that their stuff. And on this record, and so I remember this record. Some friends of mine in college had this and really liked them, and I remember hearing some of these songs from when they would play it. The only one I think I remember from the time that this came out was Me, Myself, and I remember that being a single that I.
Yep.
I don't remember if I saw the video or just heard it on the radio or maybe both, but I do remember that. So I was excited to listen to this record this week, and I really like this. A lot of the sampling and a lot of the beats and stuff. It's a very 70s sounding kind of record, whether it's like a funk or a soul or R&B or a jazz or some sort of element like that. Like you can tell that there's this kind of like production quality to it that just kind of, it's a little bit of it's not entirely crisp and clean. It's more of a muffled type of production. And that the psychedelia definitely stands out as kind of being a good descriptor of this, and it reminds me a lot of like, I think I'm more familiar with Tribe Called Quest, and it's got a similar type of vibe as a Tribe Called Quest record does, and I like that a lot. I kind of like that muffled production. I like the old school kind of like soul sounds and beats that you get overall from this, and it's just perfect. It's a very smooth kind of flow, and I like all the the rapping here, the voices on here. I think that they fit in really well with this. This is like a fun kind of. It's also kind of, it's a goofy record. I think it's in part because of the skits that are in here.
Yep.
It starts off with like a quiz show, and they're asking these ridiculous questions, and throughout the record they get a different contestant to answer, and then at the end they're like, if you know the answers, send in 2 proofs of purchase, which made me laugh because I was like, oh yeah, remember the proof of purchase thing that you would have to send in and whatever. So those are fine. It's kind of like throwaway stuff for me. It's they're usually kind of quick, and I don't know. It did become kind of a staple in a lot of hip hop records of the 90s, at least that I'm familiar with. So
yep.
I don't know. That'd be kind of like an interesting thing just in and of itself, that whole thing about the skits and like, what the most famous ones were and when it started dying out. Because I don't even know if they still, like, what was the last record that did skits like this? Is this still a thing in hip hop?
Yeah,
I'm not as familiar with the newer stuff, but anyway, like most of the songs on here I liked quite a bit. I think that they've got really, really good bass lines, some cool horn parts. Oddly enough, I think that's one of the songs I liked the least was Me, Myself, and I. I'm not that kind of. I don't know what sound effect that they're using there. Like, Like it's just I'm not a fan of that as much. It's a little bit. It's a little too much over the top. But 3 is a magic number. That's a song I knew pretty well. Really like that. You could definitely tell like the Long Island kind of thing, because there's parts of it where their accents come out pretty thick, which is kind of funny as well. But but they just add water. It's like they really lean into some of that stuff. I Know is a great song. I think that's the one that's got the Steely Dan sample of it, so that might be my favorite Steely Dan song. That's like, yeah, I like that too. And it's also got the whistling from Otis Redding's Sitting on the Dock of the Bay.
Yeah.
So I like it. They're putting together these things that you're familiar with, and it's just like, yeah, that's kind of, and then they make it their own thing that kind of blends some of those other things together. But I Know is a really great tune. Some stuff like Take It Off, it's just like a repetitive thing over and over again. What is it? Can You Keep a Secret? The whispering of that. Not a huge fan of that type of sound. You don't need to do that. So some of the stuff is not landing for me, but much of it is. I think that for the most part, the fully formed songs on this, not the skits where they're goofing around, but if it's just like a fully formed hip hop song, I think that they're pretty much hitting on all cylinders, and just really like the tone and the the vibe that they're going for. So probably one of my more of all the hip hop records that we've covered so far, this one's definitely standing out towards the top for me. So yeah, big thumbs up on my end.
What about you, John?
Yeah. I really enjoy this album. I love the choices of samples. I love the variety of samples. I love that they're going back to the set, as you mentioned, Matt. There's the 70s, both the choice of samples and production and just general vibe. I always thought the cover of this album was I know they hated being called like rap hippies.
Yeah.
And they kind of came from this cover, but it was like something I saw enough interviews, and just I had enough friends of mine who were hip hop heads that are like, oh yeah, they hated being called that. Like, they liked, I think, the conscious hip hop a little bit more, but that can be an anchor on you a little bit too, because it doesn't allow you to write certain types of songs, right? When you're conscious, right? So that was another thing that probably was a little bit of a barrier too. But I think in some ways this album is a little bit of like a better for my taste, not better as a work of art, but better for my sensibilities in terms of re-listenability than what the Beastie Boys album was. Like the Beastie Boys album was very interesting to listen to, but it was a much more academic experience for me. Like I grooved a lot more on this album.
Same.
And I think and I think some of it was just the samples chosen and the way they ran the loops, and in all honesty, the flow of the MCs. It was a much more linear one-person flow, which resembles more like modern rap, or what would come to be known as conscious rap, that a 90s style, right? 2000 MC hip, as opposed to the call and response, which seems like kind of more of another era. And it just appeals to me more as a way of MCing. So those are my initial thoughts. I did, goofy's a good word to describe it, Matt. It's definitely tongue-in-cheek. I mean, when you have a song called De La Orgy, it's kind of like you kind of know what they're going for, which was like, it was a sex song, but also a joke song at the same time, which kind of made me laugh. I also like the way that some of the samples were clearly the backbeat in the way that like that early hip hop was with Good Times, right, by Chic, just clearly being this vibe. But then in other times it was much more subtle, or it was a mix of a bunch of different stuff together. And I like the fact that sometimes it was a clearly identifiable beat that stayed consistent, and other times it knifed around a little bit into different stuff. I also thought it was interesting hearing like Q-Tip just kind of come out of nowhere, and I know he was in like native tongues, but it's like, oh, there's Q-Tip just like suddenly appearing, like deep in the record too. Like, wow, it's God, what track was it? It was like 18, I think, or something like that. Now, when you're 18, you're not really at 18 because you got some skits, but still, it's probably like 13 or 14 in terms of
he's
true
on
tracks.
Buddy for sure, which is 18.
He's on Buddy for sure. I think that's the only one I'm aware of that he was on. Yeah, I think that's the one
at the end too. In Daisy Age, maybe, I can't remember now, but
he might be. I only heard him in one in my notes that I made. Yeah, they have a thousand different themes and topics. Like each song is sort of its own little slice of life sketch, which I definitely enjoy. That gives an like idiosyncratic quality to the album, and yeah, it just is. It's a different type of hip hop than what we listen to. With that being said, it does resemble a little bit of the very earliest age of hip hop that we haven't really talked about a lot. It's got some elements of that New York style of hip hop. We did Grandmaster Flash or the Furious
okay,
Five,
yeah.
like the Furious Five is what we're really talking about, right?
Okay.
Like in terms of the MCs, but we didn't cover Curtis Blow, but it's got a little bit of like what Curtis Blow's like. Not exactly, but that MC style. Whereas a lot of what we've covered has either been stuff that would lead to like a more hardcore, gangster style, or is that call and response rap that was very much of a time and a place. So this kind of goes back to the more DJ and MC style of hip hop, and we didn't really cover LL Cool J either, and he has a more linear flow like this too. So, yeah, this is a definite thumbs up for me. I really enjoy this. I've always enjoyed this album, but it was a pleasant listen. I'm glad they're back at streaming because I hope that they grab the attention of newer listeners, because I actually think this style of hip hop can travel into the current era in a way that almost no other stuff from the 80s can.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think pulling the differences, because I didn't realize that this record was like as controversial as far as the samples go, like Paul's Boutique was. But I think going back to that, when you compare the two, to me, Paul's Boutique is a busier record, even though there's a lot of samples on here. It's sometimes they seem to flow together better. There's like more of an organic flow where you almost didn't notice how many things were being sampled. Whereas in the Beastie Boys, you listen to Paul's Boutique, it's like you can tell, man, there's like 80 things happening here, and it all sounds really good, but they are still distinct. It's kind of it's really two different ways of kind of doing the same thing, with two different
It's also
results.
interesting, the piece of the clips they pick, like a little bit of Soap is the very beginning of Stand By Me, I think, right?
Yeah.
But you'd normally think of Stand By Me, you'd go like, oh darling, or like the later in it, where it really kicks in, but more it's just the da da da, and then it stops and you're like, wow, that's a interesting cut of the.
Well, it's also interesting because they don't stay with it, because that's such a recognizable bass or cello line, whatever, and it's like it's a minute-long song. I was like, when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, I want to hear more of this, and it's just like, nah, we're good, we're gonna move on. So I thought it was interesting that they didn't take something like that that's maybe the most recognizable sample on here and just get out and then move on, But yeah, I think Paul's Boutique was a busier record than this. Is the way I would describe it.
Yeah, I agree. I think they use maybe like a bass kind of soul or funk sample and kind of use that as the foundation and then build on that. It seems like I really like this album. I think it's, like John said, the groove that they had on all of these tracks, I feel like there's at least 5 or 6 like really classic songs on here that hold up today, and that are very listenable. I like their flow as well together in between the two of them, along with the DJ. I feel like they're just so creative in the way that they construct these songs and what they use from the samples. An example would be like on Potholes in My Lawn would be like adding the yodeling. I feel like that's such like an interesting thing, or even the fact that they're just using like songs from Schoolhouse Rock on The Magic Number, or these kind of little audio clips that they tack on at the end. And then, there's so many different things that you can pick up on the more you listen to this album. And I really like that. And it doesn't feel like homework. I mean, it's just kind of an added layer that you can grasp onto. I agree. I feel like, Matt, what you were saying is that Paul's Boutique is a little more like frenetic in some ways, and this is more like laid back. I feel like that plays into their attitude. I mean, when they made this album, they were 18, 19, and 20, the three of them. So it's, they're really building on, from what I read, just kind of their lives and kind of, things that went on in high school and like girls and, different, just kind of like normal everyday things, versus a lot of the other rap that we've listened to, is about crime or like kind of bigger, flashier things, or kind of more grandiose.
I'm the
stories.
Man. I'm the greatest MC on the block, which is another common theme.
And I think this is really reflective of their personalities, and interests, and I think I can see that contrast. The contrast seems very apparent to me compared to the other hip hop, which I've loved a lot of what we listened to, but this just kind of is a different lane that hadn't been highlighted up to this point. And I think a lot of
people doing this stuff exists now. I don't like them quite as much as this, but it doesn't take a lot to figure out how like Tyler the Creator, right?
It's funny,
like,
yes.
And this like it's the spiritual grandchild, right, of this, right? That just comes to mind, but there's others beyond just that.
Odd Future, the whole crew, like
Chance the Rapper,
yep.
They
said that as much in the podcast. Like Questlove was like, without De La Soul, none of those, even somebody like Kanye West wouldn't exist without
that's
De La
interesting
Soul.
To put Kanye in that too. Yeah, but like I mean, the others are so obvious. Even stuff that came later in the '90s, like Rappin' Forte and stuff like that, like are so Jurassic 5. You know, I just keep going. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like that conscious hip rap, the alternative hip hop, like that all stems from this in some sense. I think too, Questlove brought up an interesting point that he felt like the other rap he couldn't identify with those groups, and this kind of brought a different blackness, for a lack of better word, though he felt he more identified this was the type of person that he was and what he was interested in.
Well, Long Island's different than Bronx and Queens.
Yeah.
Like that part of that's what it is, right?
So, but like more like a nerdy, maybe like a nerdy black kid, like what Questlove kind of identified himself as, and I think that's what this plays into. And there's again with that like sense of humor that's on this. There's a lot of like inside jokes. They're referencing each other in the songs, and like I feel like a lot of this is like their own kind of world. I think Questlove mentioned like the world building that this has in it that he really identified with.
Well, and there's a social class element though too. You know what I mean? Because you have to have a level of safety and security and Maslow's needs met to be able to rap about some of the things you're rapping about, right? Whereas if you don't, and you know, and then Chuck D, who's also from Long Island, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, they went to college there. Yeah,
he went to college, right? So it's educated rap. You know what I mean? Coming from, so it's always your perspective to some degree. The perspective Eazy-E had, right, is very different than the perspective that like a guy who names himself after yogurt has, you know? So
yeah, that's true. Good point.
And kind of like you can't really do what De La Soul does if you're Eazy-E where he grows up, right? Because I don't know if the space exists for you to be sort of a quirky, nerdy kid and flourish.
The threat of violence, you know, kind of permeate.
Well, even it carries over to somebody like Eminem, right, who comes through a cultural thing. But, you know, could Eminem himself says he's quiet, but like, do you think a space could have existed where Eminem could be like Macklemore? You know, who grew up in like Seattle? You know, you couldn't have, right? Because you would have got your ass handed to you every day. So context is key.
Yep. But they're from what I know about the rest of their albums, they are. This doesn't sound like their next album. De La Soul is Dead is the title of their second album, and it's much more serious and not as playful as this album. And I think they continue to kind of change and
I think
evolve.
It's a response to like they felt they were getting niched on this album, and so that
and they wanted to do something different. And some critics and people think that that's their best album, so maybe check that out now that it's streaming as well. I think all of their albums are
a roller skating jam named, I'm trying to remember what it is a classic tune.
Yep. Yeah, Saturday is in that title, or something. Yeah.
Think of it like it's like a roller skating jam named Saturday or something. Yeah. I remember it being played, not so ironically, in roller skating rinks near me quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this is a really, I definitely heard this before, but I didn't have the appreciation for it when I was younger that I do now. So this is really high for me. This is probably in the top 5 hip hop albums that we've listened to. It's going to be up there on my tracks. I don't like the skits, for the record. If you cut all those out and I started skipping them on subsequent listens, I could do without those, but I liked all the songs.
Is it bad that all the skits I like in hip hop albums are ones you could never make in current hip hop? Like every album I think of that has skits that either made me laugh or that I can recite back, like you know, Doggy Style or The Chronic or Fuji's The Score. Like 90% of those things just could not be recorded.
Not the most PC things you've ever heard in your life.
Not only not PC, but just sort of like they're like just hilariously like almost like parody kind of, you know, in terms of what they're going for. So is that really the lane where skits exist best, when they are that? Or
I think so. I mean,
so like, can you even create a skit-based rap album anymore? Because yeah,
I don't know. I guess probably one of my thing is that I've never found them funny. I just find them annoying. Like, I want to get to the song.
Like in all hip hop albums, or
for the most part, yeah. I can't think of skits that I've actually.
So like $20 sack pyramid on like the Chronic didn't make you laugh, or D's nuts, or
well,
the Chinese restaurant in The Score. Like I think of there's a lot. Yeah, just there's more. I just went to like 3 frontline ones, but I did appreciate a good off-color skit in my day, so it added color to the. I also enjoyed the ones that weren't necessarily off-colored, but like things like on DMX albums when like he'd intensely like kind of interpret like Bible lyrics in his own way, kind of like "the dog is my flesh," you know, like and stuff like it definitely added an era of intensity to those. So like yeah, I did enjoy those things too. So that's a good for later, because they'll be coming Fast and Furious.
That might be an essential question. Our favorite skits.
Yeah. Or even the next the one Beastie Boys album, you know, like if it's gonna be that kind of party, I'm gonna stick my dick in the mashed potato, you know, just stuff like that where it sketches, you know, like. So there's just 1,000 of them. So that's an essential question: do you like skits or not, and do they have to be non-politically correct? So.
Yeah. Good stuff.